He saved $440,000, but lost what mattered most, the pincher. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in the homes of careful men. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of subtraction, of lights left off, of televisions never bought, of footsteps that learned long ago to take the cheaper route home. Kenji Tanaka lived in that silence for 68 years before he understood what it had cost him. This is not a story about money. It is a story about a man who confused the two things that look most alike from a distance: surviving and living. Kenji was born in the winter of 1957 in a narrow wooden house that leaned slightly to the east, as though it were tired. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbor's radio through them. And in February, the cold pressed against the paper screens with a patience that felt almost personal. In August, the heat did the same. The house had only 2 seasons, too cold and too hot. His father, Hiroshi, worked the night shift at a metal stamping factory near the Yodo River. He came home at dawn smelling of oil and iron filings, his fingernails edged in black, no matter how long he scrubbed. He spoke little. When he did speak, it was usually about money, not in anger, but in arithmetic. The price of rice, the cost of the gas heater. How many days until payday? His mother, Setsuko, ran the house with the precision of a quartermaster in a long siege. She mended Kenji's school uniform until the elbows turned shiny. She stretched a single block of tofu across 3 meals. She kept a small wooden box on the kitchen shelf, and into that box went every coin that did not have an immediate purpose. Kenji loved that box. He loved the weight of it when his mother lifted it down to count. He loved the small, dry music the coins made when they shifted. To a boy of 7, the box was not a household tool. It was a charm against fear. One evening, he must have been 8, because the typhoon that year had taken half the persimmon tree. He watched his mother stack the coins into careful piles on the kitchen table. 10-yen pieces, 50-yen pieces, the rare and serious 100. She worked slowly, her lips moving without sound. "Every yen has a purpose," she said, without looking up. "If you don't control it, it disappears, and then you disappear too." Kenji did not know what she meant by the second sentence. He would spend the next 60 years finding out. By the time he was 14, Kenji had a job stocking shelves at a small grocery on the corner of his street. The owner, a stooped man named Mr. Oda, paid him in cash at the end of each week. A thin envelope, always the same weight, always slipped across the counter with the same brief nod. Other boys spent their first wages on baseball cards, on Coca-Cola and glass bottles, on the new manga that came out every Wednesday. A few of the bolder ones took the train into central Osaka and came back with stories about the bright streets of Namba. The smell of takoyaki, the girls in the record store windows. Kenji walked home every day, even when it rained, even when the wind off the river cut through his thin jacket and made his ears ache. The train fare was 40 yen. 40 yen was 4 10-yen coins. 4 10-yen coins dropped into the wooden box on the kitchen shelf made a sound he had come to love more than music. He did not feel deprived. That was the strange and important thing. He felt instead a low and steady satisfaction, like the warmth of a small fire he had built himself. While the other boys were spending, he was building something. He could not yet have said what. In his second year of high school, his homeroom teacher, Mr. Yamamoto, asked the class to write an essay on the question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Most of the boys wrote about baseball players, pilots, doctors. One wrote, with great seriousness, about becoming a samurai, which earned him a week of teasing. Kenji wrote a single careful sentence and then could not think of anything to add to it. The sentence was, "I want to be safe." Mr. Yamamoto kept him after class. He held the paper between two fingers as though it were a small, fragile bird. Tanaka, he said, safety is not a profession. It is a result. What do you want to do? Kenji looked at his shoes. He could not explain to his teacher that to his mother, safety was the only profession that mattered. That every other ambition was a luxury you bought once safety was already in the bank. Something steady, he said finally. An office, maybe. Mr. Yamamoto sighed and handed back the paper. Then be the steadiest man in the office, he said. It was meant as encouragement. Kenji took it as instruction. He took a job after university with a logistics company in the unfashionable east of the city, a firm that moved freight from the port to the inland warehouses and back again. The work was unglamorous and reliable, which to Kenji were synonyms. He found an apartment in a low concrete building 45 minutes from the office by bicycle, 55 if it rained. The rent was the lowest in the district. The walls were thin in the same way his childhood walls had been thin. He told himself this was familiar. He did not yet know the difference between familiar and chosen. His system, refined over the first decade of his working life, was a small masterpiece of restraint. He cooked all his meals at home. Rice in the morning with a single raw egg and a strip of nori. A bento for lunch, the same bento, more or less, every day for 40 years. Rice, a piece of grilled fish if it had been on sale, a pickled plum, a few strips of carrot. Dinner was usually whatever vegetables had been marked down at the grocery on his way home, simmered in dashi until they were soft. He did not own a car. He did not own a television until the company gave him one as a retirement gift, and even then he kept it in the closet for 6 months before plugging it in. He cycled to work in summer, walked to the bus stop in winter. He cut his own hair, badly, with a pair of scissors he had owned since 1981. He turned the lights off when he left a room, and sometimes when he was still in it. He kept the air conditioner unplugged from the wall, not merely off, because he had read somewhere that appliances drew a small current, even in standby. If you had asked him in those years whether he was unhappy, he would have looked at you with genuine puzzlement. Unhappy? He had a job. He had a home. He had savings. The numbers in his bank book went up every month, in small, precise increments, like a tide that only ever came in. What more, he might have asked, was a life supposed to contain? She came into the office on a Tuesday in April, the year Kenji turned 29. She was hired as an administrative assistant in the accounts department. Her name was Aiko Mori, and the first thing Kenji noticed about her was that she laughed at things that were not, strictly speaking, jokes. The photocopier jammed. She laughed. Someone spilled tea on the floor near her desk. She laughed, and then helped clean it up. The vending machine ate Mr. Sato's 100-yen coin without delivering his coffee. She laughed so hard she had to sit down, and then she gave Mr. Sato her own coffee, which she had just bought. Kenji watched her from across the open-plan room with the wary fascination of a man observing a species he had read about but never expected to encounter. She seemed to be operating on some currency he did not understand. She gave things away: coffee, time, small kindnesses, the last rice cracker in the office tin, and she did not appear to be running out. They began eating lunch at the same table by accident, and then by habit, and then by something that was no longer accident or habit. He brought his bento. She brought hers, which was always more colorful than his, and he suspected more expensive. One day, she looked at his lunchbox, the same 3 compartments, the same brown rice, the same withered umeboshi at the corner, and smiled. "You're very disciplined, Tanaka-san." "It saves money," he said. He had answered this question, or its variants, perhaps 200 times in his life. The answer had become reflexive, like the patellar tendon jerk a doctor tests with a small rubber hammer. She did not argue. That was the second thing he noticed about her. She did not argue with him the way other people sometimes did about his choices. She did not call him cheap or sad or tell him he was missing out. She simply tilted her head a little, as if she were considering a painting from a new angle. "That's good," she said, "as long as you don't forget to live too." He did not understand what she meant. He nodded as though he did. She went back to her tamagoyaki, which was bright yellow and faintly sweet, and which she had, he later learned, made fresh that morning at 4:30 before catching the train. That night, walking home along the river, Kenji turned the sentence over in his mind. "As long as you don't forget to live too." The grammar of it bothered him. It implied that saving and living were two different activities, two parallel roads, and that a person could conceivably travel one while neglecting the other. He had always assumed they were the same road. He filed the sentence away, intending to think about it later. He thought about it, on and off, for the next 39 years. They married in a small ceremony at the city office, followed by a meal at a soba restaurant Aiko's uncle owned. There was no honeymoon. Kenji had calculated that a honeymoon, even a modest one to the hot springs at Arima, would cost the equivalent of 3 months' utilities. Aiko said she understood. She wore the same dress to dinner that she had worn to the ceremony, and in the photograph from that night, she is laughing at something off camera. Her hand half raised as if to wave the photographer away. Kenji has looked at that photograph many times in the years since. He has tried and failed to remember what she was laughing at. Aiko moved into his apartment, which was too small for 2 people and became by some small daily miracle large enough. She hung a single woodblock print above the table, a heron standing in shallow water, its reflection broken by ripples. She bought a plant, a modest pothos, which thrived on her attention and survived, somehow, his neglect during her later illness. She did not try to change his system. She entered it, instead, and made it kinder. The bento boxes acquired small flowers carved from radishes. The dinner vegetables began to taste of things he could not identify and was afraid to ask about, in case asking made them stop. She found the cheapest greengrocer in the district, then a cheaper one, and brought home small bags of Triumph. But every now and then, in the evenings, sitting across from him at the low table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, she would say something like, "My friend Mariko went to Hokkaido last week. She said the lavender fields were beautiful. Have you ever been north?" And Kenji would say, "Not yet. Maybe one day, when we're more secure." And Aiko would nod and sip her tea and say nothing for a long moment. And then she would talk about something else, a film she wanted to see, a restaurant a coworker had recommended, a small festival in a neighboring town. And Kenji would say, with the same gentle and absolute conviction, "Maybe one day, when we're more secure." Security was a horizon. Like all horizons, it retreated as he approached it. Haruto was born in the spring of 1989. Yumi followed 3 years later, in a typhoon, while Kenji sat in the hospital corridor, calculating the cost of the parking meter against the cost of moving the car to the free lot 4 blocks away. He moved the car. He has never told anyone this. The apartment, which had been large enough for 2, became small again. They did not move. Kenji ran the numbers and found that a larger apartment would cost an additional 15,000 yen a month, which over 20 years would compound into a sum that frightened him. The children shared a room. Then, when Yumi turned 12 and refused, Aiko gave up the small alcove she had used as a sewing nook so that Yumi could have a corner of her own. Haruto grew up watching his father with the careful attention of a boy who wanted to be approved of. He learned to switch off lights without being asked. He took the bus instead of the train. When he wanted a baseball glove, he saved up for it himself for almost a year. and presented the receipt to Kenji as a kind of offering. Kenji said, "Good," and clapped him on the shoulder, and Haruto carried that single syllable around like a medal for weeks. Yumi was different. Yumi watched her father the way a scientist watches a specimen, with curiosity, but also with the conviction that she herself was a separate organism. She was 9 when she first asked the question. They had passed a family at a restaurant, a real restaurant, with paper lanterns and a menu posted outside, and the family was laughing, 4 of them squeezed into a booth, the children's faces shining with the particular shine of grilled eel. Yumi had stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at her father. "Why don't we go out like other families?" "It's unnecessary," Kenji said. He was not being unkind. He genuinely believed it. The eel at home was almost as good if you bought it on the day before the sell-by date and grilled it with a careful hand. "But isn't it part of life?" Kenji hesitated. He was rarely hesitant. The pause lasted long enough for Aiko, walking a few steps ahead with Haruto, to glance back. "Life is about stability," Kenji said at last. Yumi, 9 years old, frowning slightly, said, "Maybe it's also about living." Kenji laughed, a short, surprised laugh, and ruffled her hair, and they walked on. He did not take the sentence seriously. He filed it away with the dozens of small and clever things children say. He would remember it, with terrible clarity, 40 years later, in a quiet apartment after a quiet funeral. The decades passed in the way decades do, invisibly, until they had passed. Kenji was promoted, modestly, 3 times. His salary rose, his lifestyle did not. Each raise was absorbed, almost the moment it arrived, into the small ascending column of numbers in his bank book. He did not buy a house. The down payment, he calculated, could earn more in the bank than the property would appreciate, if you accounted properly for taxes and maintenance and the unexpected expenses that homeowners forgot to mention. He did not buy a car. He did not replace the refrigerator until it stopped cooling, and even then he bought it used. Family vacations, when they happened, were exercises in optimization, a 2-night stay at a budget ryokan 2 hours from the city, a day trip to a public beach with packed onigiri and bottled tea. Once, when Haruto was 12, they went to Kyoto for a single afternoon and walked through 3 temples in a state of low-grade rush, because the train fares would double if they stayed past 5 o'clock. Aiko took photographs on those trips with a small disposable camera. She developed the film at the cheapest shop she could find. She arranged the prints in albums, and on Sunday evenings she would sometimes sit on the floor with the children and turn the pages, narrating each picture with the warmth of a tour guide, describing a country only she had visited. There were happy moments in those albums. Kenji is in some of them, often slightly out of focus, often looking at his watch. Once, Haruto must have been about 16. Kenji overheard Aiko speaking on the phone to her sister in the next room. He had come home early and was taking off his shoes in the entryway, and Aiko had not heard him. Her voice was low and unguarded. No, he's a good man," she was saying. "He's a very good man. He believes the future is more real than the present. He's been waiting for the future since I met him." There was a pause. Whatever her sister said in reply made Aiko laugh. That same laugh, after all those years, that had first caught his attention across a crowded office. I know, but what can you do? You can't make a man eat the cake if he's still wrapping it for later." Kenji stood very still in the entryway. After a moment he opened the door again, closed it loudly, and called out as though he had just arrived. Aiko hung up the phone and came to greet him. She kissed him on the cheek. She asked about his day. She did not tell him about the conversation, then or ever. That night, lying in the dark beside her, Kenji thought about the cake. He thought he understood what she had meant. He resolved to do something, soon, to take her somewhere, to surprise her with a small extravagance. A weekend in Nara, perhaps, or dinner at the restaurant near the station with the paper lanterns. He fell asleep before he could decide which. In the morning, the resolution was still there, but it had become smaller, and there was a meeting at 9, and a quarterly report due on Friday. And the resolution, like so many resolutions, was filed under soon. Soon is the longest word in any language. It is longer than forever, because forever at least admits it will never end. Kenji retired at 67. The company gave him a small ceremony, a bouquet of flowers, the television he would not unbox for 6 months, and an envelope containing a bonus he immediately deposited. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his bank book and a cup of tea, and he added up the numbers. He had been adding them up, with various refinements, for 53 years. But this was the final tally, the moment for which all the smaller moments had been preparation. The figure, in yen, was the equivalent of approximately 440,000 US dollars. No debt, no financial risk, no uncertainty. A fortress, built one 10-yen coin at a time, against a future that would not be permitted to surprise him. He showed the bank book to Aiko. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and took his hand. She did not say anything. He thought at the time that she was moved. He thought she was proud. Later, much later, he would wonder if she had been saying goodbye to something. Not to him. To the version of her life that had been waiting, all those years, in the wings, for permission to come on stage. He said, "Now we can do everything. Anywhere you want to go. Anything you want to do." She smiled. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said. "Let's plan something soon." It was the last time she would use the word soon, as though it still meant what it used to mean. It began with a cough that did not go away. Aiko mentioned it casually, over dinner, in the way she mentioned most things, with a small, apologetic laugh, as though her body's failures were a minor social embarrassment. She had been to the clinic. The doctor had ordered tests. The tests had come back, and there were more tests. Kenji listened. He calculated automatically the cost of the tests against the insurance coverage. He noted that the deductible would be manageable. He told her, with what he believed was reassurance, that they had the money for whatever was needed. She looked at him across the table, that same look he had not been able to define, all those years, the one that was not anger, but was not nothing. And she said, "I know we do." The diagnosis came in the autumn. The doctor used careful words, the careful words doctors use. The words that are designed to fall on the listener in slow motion, so that the listener has time to arrange their face. Kenji arranged his face. Aiko beside him did not bother. She simply nodded, as though the doctor were confirming something she had already suspected, and asked how much time they were talking about. The doctor said, "A year, perhaps a little more, perhaps a little less." He gripped the arm of the chair. He thought, absurdly, of the bank book in the drawer at home, and of how little use $440,000 suddenly was, against a number measured in months. They went home. Aiko made tea, because that was what she did when something needed to be absorbed. They sat at the low table with the heron print on the wall, and the pothos plant on the shelf, and the early evening light coming through the window the color of weak honey. Kenji said, "We can do everything now. Travel, eat out, go anywhere you want. We have the money. We have always had the money. I'm sorry that He stopped. He did not know how to finish the sentence. He had spent his whole life finishing sentences. This one defeated him. Aiko set down her cup. She looked at him for a long time. There was no reproach in her face. There was something worse than reproach. There was a tenderness so complete that it felt like forgiveness for a crime he had not yet admitted to committing. "Kenji," she said, "I didn't need it before because I had time. The time was the gift. We had so much of it. We had all of it. And now," she said, "time is the one thing we don't have." He began to cry. He had not cried since his mother's funeral, 26 years earlier. He cried the way men of his generation cry, which is to say, almost silently, with his shoulders shaking, and his hands pressed flat against the table, as though he were trying to hold the table down. Aiko got up and came around to his side of the table. She put her arms around him. She rested her cheek on the top of his head. She did not tell him it was all right. She had never lied to him, and she was not going to start now. She said instead, "We still have some. Let's not waste what's left." They tried. They went to Hokkaido in July, when the lavender fields were at their peak. Aiko walked slowly between the rows, one hand on Kenji's arm, and she stopped often to breathe. Partly because of the disease, partly, he thought, because she was trying to take the place into herself, to memorize it, to carry it with her wherever she was about to go. They ate at restaurants, real ones with menus and waiters and the small ceremonies of being served. Aiko ordered things he had never seen her eat: uni, foie gras, a dessert that came under a glass dome filled with smoke. She ate small portions and laughed at the rest. She said the laughter was the part that counted. They went to a hot spring in Arima, the honeymoon they had not taken, 40 years late. The mineral water was the color of rusted iron. They sat in the steam in the evening, the mountains turning purple around them, and Aiko closed her eyes and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," 3 times, like a small and serious prayer. Kenji thought, watching her, "I could have given her this every year. I could have given her this every year for 40 years. The math of that thought was unbearable. 40 trips, 40 seasons of lavender, 40 evenings in steam. He had traded all of them for a number in a bank book. And the number was now sitting at home, in a drawer. And the woman was here, in the steam. And the woman was leaving. She got tired faster as the autumn came on. By December, she could not travel. By February, she could not leave the apartment. By March, she could not leave the bed. He sat with her. He read to her, newspapers at first. And then, when the newspapers seemed too full of a world she was already departing from, novels she had loved as a young woman. He fed her small spoonfuls of soup. He held her hand, which had grown so light it felt like the bones of a bird. On a Tuesday in April, the same month almost to the day that she had first walked into his office 39 years earlier, she opened her eyes, looked at him, and said very clearly, "Don't be afraid of the rest of it, Kenji. Spend it. Spend the time. Spend it on the children. Spend it on something foolish. Promise me." He promised. She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. The apartment was the same size it had always been. After the funeral, it became enormous. Kenji discovered that silence has weight. The silence of his childhood house had been one kind of silence. The silence of careful poverty. The silence of his marriage had been another. The silence of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms so well, they no longer needed to speak. The silence after Aiko was a third kind. It was the silence of a sentence that has been cut off in the middle, with the second half hanging in the air, refusing to either arrive or disperse. He sat at the low table. He drank tea. The pothos plant, on the shelf above the heron print, began to yellow at the edges. He watered it carelessly, and then one evening, with great care, the way she had, it revived. He found this unbearable and also somehow consoling. He took down the photo albums. He had not looked at them in years. He sat on the floor. His knees protested. He was 68, and he turned the pages slowly. There were the children in the park with the homemade onigiri. There was Aiko in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, laughing at something. There was the single afternoon in Kyoto, the 3 of them in a hurried row in front of a temple, his own watch visible on his wrist. And there were the gaps. Whole years in some cases, with only a handful of photographs. 1996, nothing but a single picture of the children at a school sports day. 2002, 3 photographs, all of Yumi's middle school graduation. 2008, 2009, 2010, a thin folder. The years he had been most focused, most disciplined, most efficient, those were the years that left the smallest visual record, as though he had spent them with his eyes closed. He sat on the floor, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once, and that he could not unfeel, that he had not been saving for the future. He had been hiding from the present. The bank book was not a fortress. It was a place he had gone to avoid the harder, less measurable work of being alive. His son came over on a Saturday in May. Haruto was 37 now, with a wife and a daughter of his own. A quiet, steady man with his father's careful eyes, and mercifully his mother's mouth. The mouth that was always almost about to smile. They sat at the low table. Kenji had made tea badly. Haruto did not mention it. After a long silence, Kenji said, "I wish we had traveled more. I wish we had eaten in restaurants. I wish we had—" He gestured vaguely at the apartment, at the years, at the careful and meticulous structure of his life. "I wish we had enjoyed it more, while she was here." Haruto looked into his tea. He was a kind man. He did not want to wound his father. "You thought there would always be time," he said at last. Kenji closed his eyes. Yes. They sat for a while. Outside, somewhere down the block, a child was learning to ride a bicycle, and was being loudly encouraged in the effort. Then Haruto said carefully, "Father, she knew. Mother knew you loved her. She told me. Many times. She told me you showed it the only way you knew how." Kenji did not answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "She deserved more ways," he said. His daughter was harder. Yumi was 43, an architect in Tokyo, a woman who had spent her adult life building rooms for other people to live in. She had not been close to him in years, not estranged exactly, but cool, polite, like a niece who visits at the proper holidays. She came to the apartment a month after the funeral. She walked through the room slowly, touching nothing, the way a buyer might inspect a property. She stood for a long time in front of the heron print. At the table, finally, she said, "I'm not going to lecture you, Father. There's no point." "Lecture me," Kenji said. "Please, I've earned it." She looked at him. For a moment he saw in her face the 9-year-old on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, frowning up at him, asking the question he had failed to answer. "You taught me one good thing," she said. "Do you want to know what it was?" He nodded. He did not trust his voice. "You taught me," she said, "that being careful with money is not the same as being careful with your life. I watched you, and I decided I would never confuse the two." She paused. "I take my children to restaurants, Father. I take my husband to the sea. I waste money on things that make us laugh. I think of you every time I do it. You are the reason I know how." She was crying by the end. So was he. They sat across the table from each other, two careful people who had finally run out of carefulness, and they did not try to comfort each other. Because the truth between them did not require comfort. It required only to be admitted and witnessed and survived. There was a park near the apartment where the family had gone on Sunday afternoons in the years when the children were small. A modest park, a few cherry trees, a pond with carp, a wooden bench under a maple. Kenji began going there in the evenings. He sat on the bench. He watched other families. He watched fathers who were not him, fathers who were buying ice cream from the cart by the gate, and complaining to no one in particular about how expensive the ice cream had become. He watched mothers chasing toddlers. He watched a young couple sharing a single bento box and laughing about something only the two of them could see. One evening, an old woman sat down on the other end of the bench. She was perhaps 80, small and round, With a paper bag of bread crusts, she was tearing up for the carp. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then she said, without looking at him, "You have a sad face, Oji-san." He almost laughed. "My wife died," he said, "in the spring." "Ah," said the old woman. She tore another piece of bread. "How long were you married?" 39 years. "That is a long time. That is a real marriage." She threw the bread into the pond. The carp, orange and white, surged toward it. "Were you good to her?" Kenji opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought about the bento boxes with their carved radish flowers. He thought about the heron print and the pothos plant and the 40 years of lavender she had not seen until the last summer of her life. "I was tearful with her," he said finally. "I don't know if that's the same thing." The old woman considered this. She tore another piece of bread. "It isn't," she said. "But sometimes careful is what a person knows how to do. And the woman who married you, she would have known the difference between careful and unloving. If she stayed, she knew." She stood up, brushed the crumbs from her lap, and walked away without saying goodbye. Kenji sat on the bench for a long time after she had gone. The light changed on the pond. The carp quieted. A father somewhere behind him called out a name, and a child somewhere ahead of him came running. The $440,000 sat in the bank. For a long time, Kenji could not decide what to do with it. To spend it felt like a betrayal of the years that had built it, of the version of himself who had believed with such fierce conviction that the number itself was the meaning. To leave it untouched felt like a worse betrayal, of Aiko, of her last instruction, of the small, clear voice that had told him in the last week of her life to spend the time. He sat with the question for almost a year. Then one morning in the second spring after her death, he opened a notebook and began to write. He wrote out a list. It was the kind of list his mother would have made, careful, numbered, in his small, precise hand. But it was not a list of expenses. It was a list of things he had postponed. A trip with Haruto and his family to Okinawa, where Haruto's daughter, Kenji's only granddaughter, had never seen the sea. The cost was significant. He wrote it down without flinching. A scholarship in Aiko's name at the small primary school where she had once volunteered to teach calligraphy on Saturdays. Enough to send 3 children a year through middle school for as long as the principal could be persuaded to keep the program alive. A monthly dinner with Yumi, whenever she could get away from Tokyo, at a real restaurant, with paper lanterns, if possible. He would not look at his watch. A trip, alone this time, to the lavender fields in Hokkaido in July when the rose would be at their peak. He would not take photographs. He would simply walk between the flowers, slowly, and breathe. He looked at the list for a long time. Then he wrote, at the bottom, in a hand that shook only slightly, "Spend it, all of it, before the time runs out." In the neighborhood, in the years that followed, people began to refer to him, gently, almost affectionately, as the pincher. It was not an insult. Most of them had known him for decades. They had watched him cycle to work in the rain. They had watched him cut his own hair. They had watched, too, the slow, careful unfolding of his last years. The trip to Okinawa with his granddaughter on his shoulders. The scholarship that bore his wife's name on the small bronze plaque outside the school. The Saturday evenings at the restaurant by the station, where he and Yumi could be seen through the window, talking, sometimes laughing. The lanterns red and gold above them. They called him the pincher because the name had become, in the telling, a kind of shorthand. A lesson passed quietly between neighbors, between parents and children, between old friends who had begun to feel the press of their own time. The lesson was not, do not save. The lesson was, do not mistake the saving for the life. Kenji Tanaka had done almost everything right. He had been honest, he had been faithful, he had been disciplined and provident and kind. In the small, careful way, he understood kindness. he had built with his own 2 hands and 1,000 small refusals, a fortress against every disaster he had been taught to fear. He had only failed at one thing. He had waited too long to live. On the last page of his notebook, the one he kept in the drawer beside the bank book, in the small apartment where the heron still stood in its broken water and the pothos still climbed the shelf, he wrote a single sentence. He wrote it in his small, precise hand, the hand that had counted yen for 60 years. He underlined it once. You don't only save for life, you must also live it while you can. Money can protect your future. It cannot recover your past. It cannot recreate the moments you chose to delay. It cannot bring back the woman who waited, with her quiet patience and her small, bright laugh, on the other side of a door you kept telling yourself you would open. Soon. Soon is the longest word.